My name is Margaret Horvath, and tonight we're going to talk about families amidst racial trauma. And I'm just going to start you off with a few technical tips. To use or view the chat box, press the chat icon that looks like a word bubble at the bottom of your screen on the black bar. To use or view the Q&A, press the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen on the black bar. Add closed captioning by clicking the button on the black toolbar. To listen to the audio, make sure your computer or headphone speakers are turned on and the volume is adjusted. You will be muted during the session and will not be able to share your screen. To exit or change to full screen speaker or gallery view, click on the top right button or view options drop-down menu.
Thank you, Margaret, and welcome everyone to our second year of Join the Conversation series, organized in partnership with the TDSB Parent and Community Engagement Office, PCEO for short, and the Parent Involvement Advisory Committee, PIAC for short. My name is Felicia Cito-Lau. I'm a PIAC co-chair, and it is my honor to welcome and thank each and every one of you for joining us this evening virtually over Zoom and on YouTube for the topic of families amidst racial traumas with our keynote speaker, Charmaine Lane. We start our program with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge we are hosted on the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Now, I pass it on to Dee Williams, my PIAC co-chair, to share the conversation agreement.
Thank you for that, Felicia. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dee Williams. I'm one of the PIAC co-chairs, the Parent Involvement Advisory Committee at TDSB. And I just want to set a few expectations and ground rules for this conversation, our conversation agreement coming to this space. We are going to be staying engaged. Staying engaged means remaining morally, emotionally, intellectually, and socially involved in the dialogue. We acknowledge that we will feel discomfort. This norm acknowledges that discomfort is inevitable, especially in dialogue about race, and that participants make a commitment to bring issues into the open. It is not talking about these issues that create divisiveness. The divisiveness already exists in society and in our schools. It is through dialogue, even when uncomfortable, the healing and change begin. We invite you to speak your truth. This means being open about thoughts and feelings and not just saying what you think others want to hear. Expect and accept non-closure. This agreement asks participants to hang out in uncertainty and not rush to quick solutions, especially in relation to racial understanding, which requires ongoing dialogue. So welcome to the space. It's great to see you all here. And I'll turn it back over to my fellow co-chair, Felicia.
Thank you so much, Dee. Our keynote speaker this evening, this session, Charmaine Lane, brings a broad wealth of training, experience, insight, and perspective to us. Charmaine is a registered psychotherapist, trainer, facilitator, and a cultural consultant practicing in the city of Toronto. She holds a Master of Science degree in counseling psychology with a concentration in marriage and family therapy, and a bachelor's degree in psychology. She's an advocate for young people of color and have rallied on their behalf. She is experienced in trauma and how it affects racialized youths, and most specifically, youth of African descent. She is experienced in children and adult mental health and specializes in trauma and its contribution to other mental health issues such as depression and anxiety. Please join me in welcoming Charmaine Lane. Thank you, Charmaine.
You just need to unmute.
And I'm unmuted. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to be here. And I didn't know we'd be streaming live on YouTube. And so now I have the jitters. No, I'm kidding. I actually am hoping that people might bump into our talk tonight, even by accident, and end up coming here and joining our conversation. I think Dee said it best, speaking about anything to do with race and ethnicity and anything that has to do with the humanness, because that's what I believe it is. Race is the one thing that all of us in society struggles with the most. And for me, it's the thing that I like to talk about the most. And so tonight I'll be using race and ethnicity interchangeably, because I believe that, in a lot of circles, people will say, and I'm not disputing or arguing that tonight. I'm simply saying a lot of people might tune in and say, well, race is not a thing. Race is actually a social construct. So we understand that what we're really speaking about is ethnicity, right? So for myself, I could say my ancestry is in Africa, whereas my place of my culture is somewhere else. I won't say where else on this call, but ancestry is Africa, and then who I am, the way I was brought up, and whatever other contributions is somewhere else. So tonight I'm excited. We're going to be looking at, like she said, working with Black youth and family amidst racial trauma. So tonight you're going to be able to look at, you're going to learn with me, understand how historical trauma presents today, recognize the impact of racial trauma on Black bodies and anti-Black racism. We're also going to describe symptoms of racial trauma, which is one of the traumatic pieces that is not listed anywhere. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. As far as listed anywhere where it can be diagnosed. So we haven't reached there yet. Understand similarities between trauma-informed care and anti-oppressive and anti-racism care, and also describe actionable steps to address issues of anti-Black racism with youth and families. So I like to always start with a case scenario. Normally I'm in front of an audience who can participate and we can, sort of have a rebuttal going back and forth, and people can always let me know what they're thinking about the scenario. Before I start though, I'd also like to preface it by saying, although we're discussing racial trauma, I'm not implying that every person who experiences racism will also have racial trauma. We're not saying that. But the goal of anything I teach when it comes to racial trauma is for us to always understand that it could be a possibility. So it can never be taken off the table. The passion for this work came about when I realized racial trauma was never a part of the equation. It was never on the table. So we'd be treating secondary diagnoses such as anxiety, depression, and no one is factoring what could have happened and how the person's race can be a part of that equation. And so my work was birthed out of that, having clients that would come to me and, young people would be crying about all the discriminatory practices that was happening against them, and no one was actually asking them about that. So when they came into a place, what was happening was, we're going to treat your anxiety, your depression, your behavioral issues, and no one was actually asking, how are you? What is it like being the only Black boy in that school? What is it like being proven guilty always and never being innocent? So you're guilty first and never being innocent. Tonight, when we think of racial trauma, I'm aware that it doesn't just happen to Black people. But tonight for this webinar, we're looking at it through the lens of Black bodies. All right, so first and foremost, I'm starting with a scenario. Hello, my name is Jalen and I'm 5 years old. Today I was playing with my friend Kamal, who recently moved to Canada from India. An older white boy, Eric, came and took our ball. I asked him to return the ball, but he refused. I tried retrieving the ball and the teacher saw me taking it from the older boy's hand. My teacher immediately accused me of fighting with the boy and took away all privileges. I overheard the teacher saying that I was aggressive. It was reported to my mother when she picked me up from school that I was fighting and that if this happened again, I would be suspended. The question begs tonight, does a 5-year-old get suspended? Yes, they do. And 5-year-old Black boys are getting suspended on a daily basis. my question that I would normally ask to my audience is, what is happening in this case? Identify and name the anti-Black racism in this case, and name some of the implicit biases expressed by the teacher. Another thing I need to let you know is that this is actually a real case. So as a consultant, I'm called by parents, I'm called by school boards, whatever, to talk about issues such as this. For me, there's a lot happening in here. We see the implicit bias, we see the anti-Black racism, because it's also important to note that racism is not a monolithic process, right? Yet, Black people are a part of the BIPOC, we're a part of the POC, and yet there's a hierarchy of how Black bodies are treated. And so Jalen was on the playground. He's younger than the white boy who had taken the ball, and he's also there with Kamal. Nothing was said about Kamal. The white boy wasn't addressed, but this little Black boy who's 5 years old was assumed to be aggressive. What does that teach him? And how, if at all, is he traumatized? Because that ever gets taken into the equation. And so when you're listening to this from Jalen's perspective, he's telling, and it shows you that he also knows what has just happened. The thing about, when we think about racial trauma as it pertains to Black children, and subsequently, or to Black bodies and subsequently Black children. And I'm putting it in that order because whether you're a Black professional, whether you're a parent, it doesn't matter who you are, you at some point have experienced discriminatory practices and microaggressions. And if you do, what does it relate to, right? Or what does it later on become? Does it become traumatic for you? And if it does, how does that present? So we're going to talk about all that. All right, so I know people are probably, aware of anti-Black racism's definition, but I would be remiss to not put it in any training that I'm doing as a refresher for others. So I will take out this idea that we know what it is. Anti-Black racism is defined as policies and practices rooted in Canadian institutions, such as education, healthcare, and justice that mirror and reinforces beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotypes, and or discrimination towards people of Black African descent. Right? So again, of Black ancestry. Doesn't matter where in the diaspora we land. This situation, anti-Black racism, affects us. And so the question begs then, why is anti-Black racism even necessary? And how much of a thing is it really? Right? And I've been asked those questions. I've been told that it's a clutch for Black people. I've been told that, why group ourselves to say that? But for anyone who works in systems and want to be very honest, we can honestly say that the way that Black people are treated, there is a hierarchy, right? And so I'm not here to talk about the model minority myth, but that exists, where everyone else is in the middle, there's white, everyone in the middle, and Black is here. And so everyone is trying to get away from Blackness, right? No one wants to be too dark, because too dark means you're too close to Blackness, whether you're of another race and you're too dark. So we have colorisms and we have all other things happening. So when a young Black person is told implicitly, not explicitly, and by told, I mean, so they're seeing it in the media, they're seeing people bleaching their skin, because what in essence that is saying, your skin is not good enough. So we're trying to get away from that. When they see people say, you're beautiful for a Black person, or, you're smart for a Black person, what we're telling young people and essentially Black people about themselves is that you're not good enough. So how does that not become traumatizing? And why hasn't the DSM, which is the manual that speaks to trauma, that speaks to all the diagnoses that we give to people, why hasn't racial trauma been placed in the manual? The DSM has said, or the powers to be of the DSM has said, that it doesn't meet the criteria. I'm here to submit to you that based on research, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through, by Dr. Erlanger Turner and other people that have done the work, we find that racial trauma has everything that PTSD does and then some. So there's now also a fear for white people and other things like that. All right, so I'll continue here. So another perspective on anti-Black racism, it is a specific exclusion and prejudice against people visibly or perceived to be of African descent, what most of us would commonly call Black people, right? So anti-Blackness goes beyond bad feelings, negative attitudes, or stereotypes. So it's way beyond that. It goes to the core of why we're talking about racial trauma tonight. It goes to the core of you saw the Capitol of the United States being stormed by mostly white protesters, and no one was there ready, to actually do anything about this. But we saw when Black Lives Matter or any other group that had to do with Black bodies were getting ready to go there, they were ready. What does that speak to that? Even if you do not pose a threat, that we're deciding, we've imagined that you pose a threat, so we're preparing for that. So what does that do to young people when they're watching from all over the world? Doesn't matter, again, where in the diaspora we are. What does that do to Black adults who are professionals, who are teachers, lawyers, doctors, psychotherapists, whatever positions we hold, and then we have to smile and nod and go to work, while battling racial battle fatigue, which I'll talk about as well. All right, so anti-Black racism is a toxic cocktail that mixes these beliefs with how people with power make decisions, how government policies are made, or how state services are delivered, right? So even the way we are able to receive services has a lot to do with the way our bodies as Black bodies are perceived. It prevents us from enjoying or exercising fundamental freedoms on equal footing, like the freedom to live and work free from discrimination or abuse. I also want to submit to you tonight and also kind of interrogate your thinking. It also really speak to even how children receive their education and how they are perceived in the classroom, who gets called on versus who doesn't get called on. This idea that don't bother applying for this program, you'll never be able to be a lawyer, you'll never be able to be a doctor. So all those things are intertwined in this. And so if that is what you're told implicitly, it is, if you're not getting some help for it, what you'll start believing about yourself. And so we need to be aware that this is out there, right? So that if we believe that PTSD exists and we believe that other forms of trauma exist, if someone got hit by a car, then we're saying, oh, that's going to be a very traumatic experience. But if someone's called the N-word, are we then deciding that that could be traumatic as well? When that is also speaking to your mind, body, your soul, and your spirit. So where do we put that? So there's a tendency to lump all ethnic minorities together. And I think for ease or out of laziness, I know, let's just put the BIPOC together, the POC, and sometimes straight ignorance. We see that in terms like Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, right? And we also see it in POC, people of color. While these terms can be useful in some situations, right, they shouldn't be used in reference to a specific race unnecessarily, because what that does then is it renders the other person's experience invisible, and it renders the other person's experience invisible instead. And especially when it comes to Black bodies, it is so different. I'll give you an example. For instance, if a Black woman with the type of hair I'm wearing tonight went to look for a helmet to go ice skating, there isn't a helmet that's designed for Black hair, unless Black people make it, right? And so all other hair textures are liable to be able to fit in a helmet. I'm speaking generally. There might be the outliers, the one-offs that might not be able to fit. But generally speaking, we're the anomaly. So when you have a little Black girl who is swimming with her friends at a pool, and she says, I don't want to get my hair wet, because she worries about what it will look like. Or you have a little Black boy who says, I don't want to go in the pool because I don't want my skin to be ashy when I get out. And so you wonder why people aren't paying attention. So caregivers, foster care people, teachers, anybody in the helping profession, and then others who are also caregivers and guardians for Black bodies. What are we doing when we're not paying attention to some of the differences? And these differences aren't to be pointed out for any other reasons, but to be celebrated. And so in order to not have trauma and racial trauma happen in Black bodies, and especially Black youth, we need to be able to point out these things in a celebratory kind of way. All right. So for instance, referring to a Black woman as a woman of color, when you could refer to her as a Black woman, can undermine her specific lived experiences of being Black. And you'll say, but why should that be any different than any other woman of color? For the example I just offered, that other women of color probably could go into anywhere, into a store, right? And pick up into Home Depot or anywhere else in Canada, Canadian Tire, wherever they sell helmets, and try to find a helmet for ice skating, whereas a Black woman would struggle to do so. And I know that because I took my daughter to get one, and we went to about 4 or 5 different places. And I had to change her hair in order for her to be able to fit. And when she went to school, when I wasn't there, the helmet was up here until someone saw and helped her. So again, these things are real. We have young Black kids that I've dealt with who are pouring bleach on their skin because the skin that they're in is not a skin that they'd like to be in. So again, this is actually a thing and it's happening. And so it's important for us to understand that it's more than anti-Black racism. Anti-Black racism is now. We're looking at racial trauma that also has been coming down through generations, right? Intergenerational trauma as well. And some people use them interchangeably. Tonight, for not other reasons, but I'm using racial trauma as I want to speak about it in the present. And as we look at post-traumatic slave syndrome in a video I'll show you, that will also speak of how we do things without even realizing that we're traumatized. All right, so the concept of anti-Black racism, Blackness pushes back against the idea that all ethnic minorities have the same lived experiences and can be shoved under a singular umbrella. To be clear, all kinds of racism are deplorable, all of it, and we know that, right? But it is still worth carving out clearer definitions for the kinds of racism that disproportionately affect certain groups like anti-Black racism. Compared to white people and Asian people, and this is research, Black defendants at Crown Court are the most likely to be remanded in custody. And this happens all the time. So again, if you're a young Black person looking at that, what does that say to you about yourself? Okay, I'm gonna show you a video as we move to speak a little bit about microaggressions. I want us to look at this video, and this is kids discussing microaggression and just the way that you know, they view it and the experiences that they've had.
I'm from Haiti and Nigeria. Like 3 things like I'm Dominican, Puerto Rican, and Black. I'm biracial. I have an African American father and an Irish American mom. My name's Monique. I'm Muslim, Indian, British, Scottish, and American. My parents are from Venezuela, and I was sharing like one of the foods that we eat, and then I got made fun of. They were like, "What is that? Ew! Oh, ew! What is that?" And like I cried because I felt like, oh, there's something wrong where I'm from. Like maybe like it's bad. Like I'm different. I am an African American adopted girl, only child, and I live with my 2 dads. I remember when I was younger, I went with my family to a restaurant, and they made us pay in advance just in case we like didn't pay afterwards, and that was kind of upsetting. You start to notice that people are different, and you have comments like they might be racist or they might not be, but by the time you get older, you know that it is racist and you should stop. I feel a little scared about if I, just walk down the street, cops might just think I'm doing something bad, and then if I try to explain to them, they won't listen, and then just beat me up and do terrible things to me. I think there's like this anxiety that kind of comes with being biracial, like that kind of eats away at you, like almost like you have to prove yourself, like that you're one or the other. Like, for example, like I hear the phrase, "You're not Black," all the time. People sometimes think that I'm supposed to like talk ghetto or like whatever that is. Oh, she's uneducated because she's African American. Because I'm Hispanic or Latino, I can't have like a lot of money. Just this weekend, I went with my friend to the Urban Outfitters, and we were shopping, and I really wanted to try on this dress. And then this lady that was just like there, she's kind of like watching me, and it's like, I'm not gonna steal it or anything. I think white privilege is the idea that in your everyday life, or something that controls the policeman, I would want to go out and look in the neighborhoods where there are people that's very friendly, so you can pick them instead of like these guys that's just doing all this training. It's better to pick people that's more minded with the community than to just pick some new guy and get on the street. Like, it's just not gonna work out. We have like these kids, they're Ecuadorian, and they get made fun of because they look Mexican, and they get told on a daily basis, oh, you like tacos? Oh, you like churros? You saw tacos? I saw your mom on the corner selling ices. The kids. Like, I feel bad for them personally, because I'm like, wow, like, they're not, and like, even though they tell them I'm not Mexican, I'm Ecuadorian, they still get teased.
Okay, so we see that and we wonder, we don't, until we speak to kids ourselves, we don't understand the trauma that it is. These children are 12 years old. You had 12-year-old Black males saying, you know, I worry about getting shot. You know, you had biracial 12-year-olds saying, well, I'm not sure which one to choose. I have to prove myself. So these are some of the things that I'd like for parents to pay attention to, that racial trauma is a real thing. Like, children are having it. And think about it. If this person, you know, the producer of this video is aware of it, so she's talking about it. But imagine your children are going to school and coming home every day and going all about their business, and no one is speaking to them about what it means to live in their skin, right? So like I said earlier, racial trauma affects not only Black people, it affects a lot of other racialized bodies. But we saw in this video, one of the things I noticed in this video was the differences in what the children spoke about, right? Every time I watch it, I think about that. So the Black children spoke about, we went to I went to the restaurant with my parents. They would have us pay prior to eating because they worried that we wouldn't pay, right? That's one piece. I worried that I would be shot. That's another piece. So anything to do with police brutality, criminality, the little Black kids were able to talk about that, while others were able to talk about other things. It's not a competition in that way, but it is for us to look at the realities of what happens when you're in a Black body and what you're working through. And so if you're a 12-year-old young person worrying about whether or not you're going to be shot, that has to be taxing on your body and very traumatic, even though you're not saying it to anyone. And so when we expect for 12-year-olds to, I'm using 12-year-olds because that's what the video said, 12-year-olds to be in class when you've just been, profiled on the street, or you are running for the bus driver leaves you, you get to class, and no one has said to you, why are you late, right? Woman clutching her purse while you're heading to the elevator closes, you're late, catching the bus leaves you because your pants is sort of saggy, you get to school, and the teacher sends you for detention without questioning any form of microaggression that you might have faced going to school. And then you get home, and what happens with your parents? You should have been at school early. This is what should have happened. So it's very important for us, whether we believe that racism causes, that someone who has had racism happen to them, or any microaggression or anything, whether we believe or not that might cause racial trauma, we want to always ensure that it's a part of the conversation and it's a part of something that we think is possible when we see certain behaviors. Let's move on. So we're going to look at microaggression. Microaggression now becomes modern day reinforcement of historical trauma. I would say for the past maybe 5 years, actually maybe a little bit more, I've noticed the term microaggression becoming a bit more, prevalent. Years ago, when I started looking at this work about 15 years ago, it wasn't as prevalent. So microaggressions are brief and commonplace verbal, behavioral, environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional. And these communicate hostile, derogatory, and negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. And I'll submit for this towards Black people. If you notice in the video, one young girl talks about, her food and different people, just saying ew and what that meant for her. that little girl is being taught that your food is not good enough. So what does she do? Right? So what that does, that could damage her self-esteem, her self-worth, the confidence that she would then have to bring that same food into any other space, right? So why is it that we're not looking to say, when we see behaviors, especially in children, or, you know, your child suddenly develops anxiety, social anxiety, I don't want to eat in the cafeteria. Why is it that no one's questioning, could something have happened to her or to him or to them or they that would say, who you are is not welcomed in this space. And therefore they've now developed depression. I no longer want to go to school. I want to lock up in my room. I'm only going to be by myself and play video games. And then there's a diagnosis. The school is then sending them to the school social worker is sending them to a children's mental health. And so the cycle is going around. And yet the question has never been asked, what is the contribution of their race to any of what they're going through? And so when I'm in therapy, that's what comes out for me all the time. Think about this definition of microaggression. It's like stoning someone to death with peanuts, right? Peanuts doesn't hurt. It's just a little stone here and there, and offering them a sip of water from time to time, right? At first it may seem harmless, but the venom penetrates under your skin like a snake bite. And that's what happens with microaggression. And so let's move on. Let's look at the three major ones. Insult. This is characterized by communications that convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage or identity. The thing that I've realized in practice and just doing this kind of work is that these things have now almost become commonplace. So people hear about micro insult, they hear about micro assault, they hear about micro invalidations. These are on TED Talks, they're everywhere, but it's not changing anything. Right? So we've almost become immune to the fact that these things are happening. Microassault, it's an explicit racial degradation characterized primarily by a verbal or nonverbal attack meant to hurt the intended victim, right? So if you're called the N-word, that is explicit. You know, I've been called the N-word more than once. And did I have racial trauma? Sometimes you're not even able to pause to process your feeling. You're not processing anything, right? Until you're laying in your bed at 4 a.m. and it hits you and the tears are flowing, because then you're realizing, oh my goodness, I did nothing to deserve that, but it happened. You're in the store and you're being followed. How do you process that? You still have to shop for your food or whatever you need, but understanding that this is going against your body. And so this is also how racial trauma is different, or is different than other forms of trauma, rather, because it's happening in real time all the time. And I'll discuss that a little bit more as we go down. Microinvalidations. This is communication that excludes, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a person of color. Are you sure, Charmaine, that happened to you? Why? Are you sure that the teacher meant that? And so sometimes parents who have had their own racial trauma and not having a voice for it or a name to call it, doesn't know how to support their children when they're at home. So the child comes home and says, I feel like the teacher was picking on me because I'm Black. And the mother said, well, I'm not sending you to school to worry about being Black. I'm sending you to school to learn. And so it nullifies. And so the piece for me that always is so important to look at is that it negates or nullify the psychological thoughts. So even your thoughts aren't your own because someone else is nullifying that, right? And and keep in mind tonight, we're not measuring intent, right? We're measuring the impact that has, right? Or the young person says, I believe that Katie did this to me because of the color of my skin. And the teacher says, no, I don't think that's the reason. You're all the same. And so right there, that young person is rendered invisible, first and foremost, because now you're telling me that all my experiences, I'm now the same as Katie over here. And so what does that do for the young person when it comes to the traumatic pieces that they walk away with? And what does that also tell them about themselves? And again, like I said in the beginning, just because someone has experienced racism doesn't necessarily mean that they'll have racial trauma. I'm not implying that at all. All right, so let's move to the other one. So trauma in the Black experience, right? these are things that we all talk about in the Black community. It sometimes becomes a running joke rather. So the trauma that is experienced through anti-Black racism is present in most interactions with Black people. And so I think for some Black people, it becomes like just a commonplace. I remember once having the opportunity to speak to a group of young men and women, young people rather, who were in a business program, you know, and I went to speak to them about what is it like being a Black professional. And at the time I was a supervisor. And I remember one young man a 21-year-old, he must have been 18 or 21, in the back of the class. And he said to me, "Miss, it doesn't matter. Every time I go into a store, I feel my anxiety." He says, if I'm in there and I need to get something from my pocket, I'm positioning myself so that someone can see that I'm going in my pocket and I'm not trying to steal anything. That's anxiety that a young person is walking around with daily, right? What does that do to your body? What happens to the mind-body connection when you're in a store and because of the tone of your skin, your ethnicity, your ancestry, you're aware that any move you make could be perceived, or that you're already perceived that way. And so now it's your responsibility all the time to be able to be carrying rather what other people think about you. So you're carrying the load of worrying about what others think about you, whether you're a thief, whether you're, you know, this young person told us on the video, I worry that from walking down the street, the police pulls me over, even trying to explain my life is in jeopardy. So why then are we not asking questions when we're speaking to young Black youth, when we're speaking to Black people in general, especially in like a school setting, in a therapeutic setting, you know, school social worker, whatever we are, even parents, why aren't we then inquiring, what does the body, the skin that you're in have to do with the way you're feeling at the moment? And we'll talk a lot about that towards the end. So again, being followed in stores, shopping while Black, cashiers asking for extra identification, insensitive remarks by coworkers and friends, profiling by law enforcement, driving while Black, being feared and avoided, racial slurs, threats, acts of microaggression can present anxiety in Black people and extreme distress in Black youth. It brings about distress in Black youth. The ones I've seen, I am presently seeing a young person who talks about, you know, even being in class, worrying about the way she sits. And that has caused her a lot of anxiety and stress because she has to constantly be so mindful of the way she's sitting. And she says, you know, I see other white girls come into the class and they just sit however they want to sit. They can wear what they want to wear. But I feel that I am constantly judged, or, you know, my body type is looked at a certain way versus other body types. So even those things people aren't talking about. And so how does that take away from this young girl's ability to participate in her work, right? How does that take away from her ability to be the best student she can be, right? Because she has to now work overtime to ensure that she's crossing all her T's and dotting all her I's, and not in the way that she should be doing in her schoolwork, but to ensure that she's not drawing extra attention to herself. And so the burden of that brings about anxiety and stress, and sometimes acting out behaviors, right? Because then you're trying to say, see me and see what I'm going through. And so what I like to call connecting behaviors, right? Connection seeking is what we sometimes see young people having. And so instead of thinking that it's connection seeking, sometimes helping professionals and parents will look at it as something else. This stuff is real. All right, so in general, when we talk about trauma, it can be defined as a psychological, emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing, right? That's normal. Lots of us know that meaning. You know, you get hit by a car, you're in an accident. The expectation is that you might be traumatized. But again, like I said at the onset, not if you are, you know, called the N-word, or you're being profiled in a store, or, you know, people have all these expectations, all these preconceived notions about you. No one's thinking about how traumatic that could be as well. We think about intergenerational trauma, right? It's a word that we throw around a lot in Canada, especially as we think about Indigenous bodies. So intergenerational trauma is the transmission of historical oppression and its negative consequences across generations, right? So we understand, you know, a lot of people, we run away from the slave narrative, but there's no way that you can actually talk about these things and not bring slavery into it and the legacy that it has left, right? So when we think about white bodies, there's a legacy that was left with white bodies. And when we think about Black bodies, there's a legacy that was left. When we think about South Asian bodies, you know, Asian bodies, all of us in our ancestry, there's a legacy. Now, the difference is what type of legacy is it? One young person on the video, she talked about, you know, having the legacy of privilege. You know, she didn't say legacy, I'm using that word, but she has the legacy of privilege, right? And not being questioned, no one, she doesn't have to think about certain things, whereas Black kids, Black people in general go around thinking about these things on a daily basis. You're in a store and you're worried that if you put your hand in your purse, you could be, you know, you know, it could be treated as though you're trying to steal something, whether you're doing it or not. And so you become nervous and anxious almost all the time. And so shopping while Black. Dr. Al-Kati, who is a professor in the States, he talks about history is not about the past, it's about the present. And so I like this little quote. It's very pedestrian, simple little quote, but in the context that he's using it is, it's not, even though we want to talk about slavery in the past and we want to talk about all these things, how has that contributed to the way that Black bodies are treated today? And how have we carried over a lot of it into our daily lives as Black people without realizing that's what we're doing, because then it has become a way of life for us, right? So let's move on here. We are, oh, I'm sorry, I'm missing a page. All right, so what is racial trauma? Racial trauma is experiencing psychological symptoms such as anxiety, hypervigilance, to threat or lack of hopelessness for your future as a result of repeated exposure to racism or discrimination. And again, Dr. Erlanger Turner is a psychologist out of the United States who talks about this. He has a book that speaks to mental health in the African-American community. And I like to really put who he is because he's one of the trailblazers of racial trauma, like somebody who's really studying it along with Dr. Kenneth Hardy and a lot of different contributors. But what I find and continue to find is, again, the DSM, which is the manual, the diagnostical manual, have not said anything about racial trauma, you know, as a diagnosis. And so Black people and other racialized bodies are the ones that have to say, okay, now let us speak to what mental health looks like in our community. Because for many years, we've allowed white people to tell us what mental health looks like for us. And so the DSM doesn't have it because to them, racial trauma is not a mental health issue. And so that's why we have to bring light to it ourselves. So symptoms can include depression and anger outbursts, much like what is typically seen in those suffering from PTSD. But what Turner has observed, additional behaviors that are specific to racial trauma, including a reluctance to interact with or general mistrust of white people, right? So you are a white teacher, you are a white clinician, you're a white adoptive parent, and you know your child was good with you until they were 12, they become 12, and then starts understanding about this, or even younger at times, and then the distrust and mistrust starts happening, right? Or just a general mistrust, like, no, I'm not going near that white police officer because this might happen, right? And so that's the additional piece that he has also found. So it mirrors PTSD. And like I said earlier, it's still not in the DSM, but there's additional pieces to it. So for me, I wonder why it's not there, right? Again, it makes me think about the idea that who defines what my mental health looks like as a racialized body, as a Black woman? Who decides what my mental health looks like? And so for years, our mental health has been defined very mainstream, right? And so what I find is that I have Black parents in community who are traumatized themselves, having racial trauma and symptoms of it, and then they're parenting children who are also racially traumatized and know where to go with it because no one's speaking about it. They don't know that this is something that I might need to speak to someone about feeling, you know, a sense of discrimination when I went to the school to speak with the teacher and the way she spoke to me and the guidance counselor, but no one, you know, again, because it hasn't been diagnosed, it's not something that's thrown around, people are not finding that they have that they could speak to someone about it to be able to figure out how to deal with it. Let's look at another quick case scenario. And again, this is a real case. Of course, the names and everything are changed. My name is Tamika. I'm a 33-year-old Black Canadian woman. I'm the mother of 3 beautiful children. I'm attending a parent-teacher meeting for my 13-year-old daughter. The teacher expressed that she's loud and has an attitude. When I questioned what she meant, she asked, "Is something going on at home? You appear stressed and a bit angry. I think I need someone else in the room with me to discuss this." She kept suggesting, asking if I had the capacity to understand everything that she was telling me. This case came across to me because someone recommended Mother to be able to speak to me about this case and, just to get some support and some advocacy. If you look at the question, what do you notice in this interaction as it pertains to anti-Black racism? There's a lot. The teacher suggested that, do you have the capacity? Your daughter has an attitude. We saw the whole thing about, is there something going on at home? Because again, there's all these stereotypes and all these notions about what Black families represent and what it looks like, right? You appear stressed and a bit angry. We know the notion of the angry Black woman. So there's so much going on here for this mother. Now you tell me what happens when this woman leaves this meeting and she goes about her business, or she goes home to her child who she hasn't heard anything about really in the meeting, because the notion is the daughter has an attitude. She's 13 years old. Now, how do we know if something is amiss or remiss rather? This is if another 13-year-old person, say they were Asian or they were white, would they be considered having an attitude if they exhibited the same sort of behavior that this young person does? And if we want to be honest, half the time it doesn't happen that way. Young Black girls are, over-sexualized. There's so many different issues that I could talk about. But one of the things that I do want to talk about is that they're treated as adults. They're treated as though, they're not allowed to just be kids and have an attitude like other kids, right? And if they do have an attitude, it becomes something else. And so, I throw these cases in here because I like for people to be able to stop and think about the reality that people actually have this happening to them. All right, so let's continue here. So we're going to look at symptoms and the presentation of racial trauma. So race-based traumatic stress trauma differs from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Victims are exposed to constant racial microaggression, and Comos Diaz is somebody who also has done a lot of work around racial trauma and race-based trauma, right? And so while the content of the traumatic experiences may differ, the trauma responses are similar. And that's one of the major things that we need to understand. And understand why is it that our brains aren't used to thinking about racism as traumatic, right? And so we have to teach our brains to begin to think about it. And it's going to be very uncomfortable and almost weird at times that how is someone traumatized by racism? But we understand that if you went to war and you're a soldier and you come back, we understand that very clearly because it's also something that our brain is trained to understand. And so for people in school, for psychologists, for social workers, anyone who's dealing with Black families and Black youth needs to begin to train their minds to think, okay, I wonder what else is happening in this situation, right? Outside of what I'd be thinking that the child is depressed or they have an attitude. What else is happening? Maybe I could engage and start asking some questions about their experiences of living in their body. So the frequency, the intensity, and the pervasiveness of racial stereotypes, racial bias, and racial discrimination produce emotional and psychological distress, as well as a physiological stress response, right? So physiologically, you're sweating, all the same things that would be happening if you were having post-traumatic stress. But again, it's not diagnosable yet. So altogether, these racial traumas occur over and over again. This is the best part when you're trying to learn about this, that this happens over and over again, right? And resulting in what is termed racial battle fatigue. Racial battle fatigue is just that. And so I'll pause here for just 2 seconds. When you think about racial battle fatigue, it's important for us to understand that it's happening in real time. So you don't have an opportunity. You see, when we think about trauma, we think about making sure the client has safety. Safety in race-based traumatic experiences is the client or the person just being able to speak about what they're going through. For them, that's safety. Safety in regular, I say regular, in mainstream trauma is going to look very different. And so if you're treating somebody who, or not treating, but if somebody is experiencing racial battle, the psychotherapist in me can't get out. I'm like, if you're treating, but if you're, in conversation with someone who has racial battle fatigue, this idea of are you feeling safe doesn't apply, right? In the same way that it would if it was a different traumatic experience, because then you want to make sure that they're no longer in danger, you're accessing for safety and all that stuff. The safety here is a space to do what's called racial storytelling, for them to be able to tell of how they're feeling, and to have someone acknowledge and say, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry you're going through that. How can I help? Blah, blah, blah. So again, racial battle fatigue is from hearing, seeing, and experiencing incessant racism and racial discrimination. Because individuals who face discrimination experience trauma symptoms similar to war veterans who experience PTSD symptoms, the racial battle occurs, right? So you're battling, it's a racial battle. This imagery connotes the arduous uphill battle. So it's a hard uphill battle and exhaustion that individuals and groups of people who face racial discrimination experience on a daily basis. And the thing about it, especially when it happens in young people, they don't have a name for it. So they don't know that's what they're going through. And so you might see it again in what I like to call connection seeking. Some people call it acting out behaviors and all that stuff. But I like to say that people are trying to seek connection when they're beginning to use their bodies, when anger, and because anger has a place, right? And so if anger is what's coming out, then what's going on, right? Do we want to look, especially if we're dealing with Black youth and families, do we want to look at something else, right? Do we want to, and I'll tell you how to do that in a minute. Do we want to actually pay attention to what else might be happening? All right, so this, if not dealt with, racial battle fatigue can lead to serious mental health problems and severe psychological distress, right? So that's something that we want to pay attention to. PTSS, post-traumatic slave syndrome, most of you listening might already be familiar with this. PTSS is a condition that exists as a consequence of centuries of chattel slavery, followed by institutionalized racism and oppression, and have resulted in multi-generational adaptive behaviors, right? And Dr. Joy DeGray is going to be speaking about that. I have a short clip from her, but it's adaptive behavior that Black people at times don't even know that that's what it is. And so sometimes it's a resilient behavior, right? And we've learned it and passed it down through generations, right? But then other times it's something that could be detrimental to us. And so even understanding the multi-generational adaptive behavior can help us. So some, again, like she says, are positive, reflecting resilience, and others that are harmful and destructive. The theory of PTSS was developed by Dr. Joy DeGray as a result of 12 years of quantitative and qualitative research. Why do you put that in there, Charmaine? It's important because I think a lot of times, again, and it could possibly be my own thinking, I feel like when Black people do certain things, that's also questioned. So for me, it was important to always put that this is a highly acclaimed woman who's done this work and did it over time. And I love her, by the way. Resilience for Black youth may include wearing their hoodie. And this is just something that I noticed from my own practice and hearing from young people. Resilience for Black youth may include wearing their hoodie at all times and in all season, as it serves as a protective shield. This may be viewed by healthcare professional, teachers, or whoever, as resistance to care when it is not. The stereotype of Black youth and Black people and Black youth is for people to assume they're dangerous, especially when wearing a hoodie. Yet for a lot of Black youth, a lot of Black adults, a hoodie is a protective shield. We're going to watch quickly Dr. Joy DeGray's quick, I think it's like 5 minutes of her explaining her post-traumatic slave syndrome.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response. Oh my God, that happens. We're talking about when we
Mhm.
look at multi-generational trauma,
Charmaine, I can't hear her.
Uh-oh.
in their families, children,
Um,
generations of folks who have experienced war.
it's all the way
We
up.
know that there are
One
residual
moment.
mental, emotional, traumatic impact.
Still can't
What I
hear
did
her.
was I started to look at the African American experience,
Okay, one
starting with
moment.
slavery.
She's just on YouTube. Should I just reference her and move on? Hello?
Yes,
I-
thanks, Elaine. Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Charmaine. Sounds good.
Yeah, just reference her and move on, right?
Yes, thanks, Elaine. Reference
Of
her and move on.
course. All right. So, yeah, she's on YouTube, Dr. Joy DeGray. She speaks about post-traumatic slave syndrome and just the generational impact of, of slavery. And it's really an important listen. And she also has a book, which is an amazing read. So if you get an opportunity, really spend some time reading that. And there's you might be surprised as to some of the things that you learn and see. All right, so let's move on. Healing the race-related wounds of trauma. There are 3 things that I've put here. There's more, but I just want to speak about how racial trauma really messes with how we see ourselves internally, right? The internalized devaluation, internalized voicelessness, and the wound of rage. Right, these are 3 of the things that, and again, Dr. Thomas Hardy is somebody who speaks about this. You can also read his work. He talks about the fact that racial oppression is a traumatic form of interpersonal violence and can lacerate the spirit, scar the soul, and puncture the psyche. And this is really important because if it's not in the DSM, and I keep referencing this because that's where I go to seek diagnostical direction. And now if someone's speaking to you and they're exhibiting racial trauma and there's nothing to say that they can take time off school or the person can take time off work or do anything differently, then what do? Because there's nowhere to bring it. So let's see what Dr. Hardy is saying. So Dr. Hardy is saying for us to be able to help Black youth and families with this, it's important for the helping professional to convey a general understanding and acceptance of the premise that race is a critical organizing principle in society. So whether you're a parent, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a doctor, whoever is having a conversation, a social worker at school with a young person, with a Black family, you want to affirm and acknowledge that race, we cannot say, well, we're all the same. And that's the mistake that we've been making when it comes to racial trauma, because we're saying to people, we're all the same, we're one people. No, when we do that, we render the person invisible, right? And so what he's saying is it's important for the helping professional or the person or whoever the young person or adult is speaking with, the Black-bodied person speaking with, to acknowledge, right, that there's a general understanding that the world is structured that way, right? So if we're dealing with you in school and you're suffering through racial trauma, but in school I'm saying to you that we're all the same, and then you head out into the world and you're in a store with your white friend who then gets treated very differently than you, then I'm then therefore lying to you, right? And so I need to affirm and acknowledge it if I'm going to help you to heal from it. And the second thing is create a space for race. And what does that mean? As a helping professional, again, a teacher, a social worker, whoever we are. And if I'm speaking to parents, I want to say that parents should also create a space to speak about race, right? Your children are home with you. Talk about some of the issues that are happening. Whether your children are Black, whether they're brown, whatever color they are, speak about some of the things that you notice and say to them, what are your understanding of what's going on, right? So we want to create a space for race. When you're dealing specifically to a Black youth and you are, say, a helping professional, for instance, you want to convey a sense of openness and curiosity. We want to take a very proactive role in encouraging conversations about race, right? We're not going to shy away from it because we have conversations about everything else. And so what we want to make sure that we're doing is we're creating a space, we're having conversations about it. And so when the young person sees that, then they know, oh, wow, here's a safe space that I can now talk about whatever traumatic experiences I've had. And I can begin to tell you my story. And so this takes us to the next one, racial storytelling. So young people are invited to share personal stories of racial experiences. This enables them to develop their voice and begin to think critically. And that's the key word there, thinking critically about their experiences growing up as a Black or youth of color. Why is this important? Racial storytelling, I think, is when I use it, it's my baseline. For instance, if I am dealing with a young person who attends, and I just finished doing 2 workshops for Durham District School Board. And say, for instance, I was doing, I had a young person who was, the only Black person attending school in Oshawa. And they came to see me, and parents says, they're depressed, they're this, they're that. One of the first questions that I would ask after, we've probably done our calming breathing exercise and as an introduction to the session is I'd probably say to the young person, what is it like attending school in Oshawa? That's one question I'd ask. And then if they said, it's okay, I would say, I know it's sort of far, it's not really in the city. Are there a lot of other Black students in the school? And so it sounds like I'm leading. I can tell you this though, for the most part, most Black kids who live in areas where usually they're the only ones in their school or in their class, or maybe one of 5 kids in a school of however many hundreds or thousands, they usually tell me right away that I am one of 5 Black students and this is how it makes me feel. And so I don't have to probe too much. But if I ever get such an opportunity where I need to, or a situation rather, where I need to probe, my next question would be direct. So what is it like being one of the, are there a lot of Black students in your school? And if they say it's 5, it's 2, whatever, then we start the conversation. So what does that feel like for you? What is it like attending school, a school where you're not seeing a lot of people who look like you? Are there any Black teachers? And then I'd start. And so how does this pertain to parents? It pertains to parents who move their children into areas, and a lot of Black people have done that, where we want better for our children, and I'm air quoting that, so we move them out of places where they're seeing people that look like them, and that also can be very detrimental in contributing to racial trauma, because then now you're having to fight your way through. And so, it's a lot to think about. And so if I'm a parent of a child who lives and attends school in an area where there's not a lot of other kids that looks like them, I would be checking in every single day. What I've found in practice is that a lot of Black parents are at times oblivious to what might be happening, and not that they themselves haven't had it happen. And so I'm not sure as to why they would think it wouldn't be happening to their children, right? The connection is usually not made. And so I would encourage that, and even if they're in the city, because sometimes it can be worse at times in the city. And so I would say wherever they attend school, do a bit of racial storytelling with your children. Try to find out what their day is like. What is it like just being a Black boy attending a school in the Toronto District School Board? Say that to your child. Say that as a social worker. Say that as a teacher. And then let the young person tell you their story. And so when they tell you their story, then we're able to find out how to meet their needs. Validation. So validation is similar to affirmation and acknowledgement. This is a tool for counteracting the devaluation. And devaluation comes when when Black people and Black youth especially begins to do what's called internalized evaluation. And for them, it's not something that's at times explicitly done. It's sometimes just an implicit thing where you see, especially the Black girls that I work with, they'll wear long weaves, and that's neither here nor there for me. For me, it's the reasoning behind it. And so a lot of times when I'm speaking to them, it's because of what beauty represents, right? And so all these other things. And so, it's getting them to understand that the notion of beauty that's placed in front of you, or let me go back, what they're explaining to me, that I'm traumatized and I feel that I need to do this extra stuff because of the notion of beauty. So I'm not good enough to just wear my hair the way that God has placed it on my head, or something close to what He's placed on my head. But I look better if I look like this. And so how do you help young people to get through that part of it, right? Understanding that they are not, that who decides what beauty looks like, right? And so again, even in the city of Toronto, start having the conversation, validate for them that they're enough, right? And so this tool for counteracting devaluation and the assault that they put on themselves, validation is more specific and personal than affirmation and acknowledgement. So when you validate for them who they are, and letting them know that your Blackness, and this is just my word, your Blackness is not a burden, right? And so helping their minds, like I said, the minds have to be trained to think differently, right? And so the thought process has to be changed to think, say, if, you know, beauty looks a certain beauty, mainstream beauty looks like this, and then there's me. So then they have to be trained to understand that my beauty is mainstream as well. That's it. I'm not an exotic being. Who I am is good enough and beautiful just the way it is, right? And then giving them the tools to be able to move out in the world. And so you wanna, if you're dealing with a young person who's struggling with, you know, their beauty, you know, traumatized in that way, beauty not being what society says it should be, or their body type or whatever, then we wanna show them images of people that look like them, that they themselves consider beautiful. And so the next time they're in society or anywhere and is faced with the same thing, then they have the tools that they need to move through it. So that's what validation does. It's a bit more personal. All right. The next one we want to look at is the process of naming. I spoke about this at the onset when I talk about racial traumas happening to people and people not knowing what exactly is going on, right? There's not a name for it because there's no diagnosis for it. There's no, you know, sometimes it's happening in your body and you're the only one who knows, and it's hard to explain it to someone. You know, a microaggression might have happened to you. Someone might have said something discriminatory and you not understanding the name for it, but you know what it feels like. You know how, you know, your back is cringing, the anxiety that's coming, and all these other pieces. And there's no name. So one of the things that we want to help people to do is the process of naming. So one of the most debilitating aspects of racial oppression is that this is a nameless condition, difficult to describe, quantify, or codify. And I see this in a lot of adult clients who are having racial trauma that just, and sometimes are afraid. And it's not just Black people. I have, you know, Asian clients who've had racial trauma who doesn't know what to call it. They just know that I have been labeled this way all my life as the smart, this and that, and that's what I've held to. And I that is not even who I am, right? And so I'm seeking therapy because I really want to speak to somebody about how being placed in that box has contributed to my anxiety over the years. And so, you know, in session, you're helping to give a name to it and quantify it and codify it for them. For young people, this is especially important because they're carrying it in their bodies and in their minds and in their spirits, and they're carrying it everywhere. And again, we think about the racial battle fatigue that they're fighting, right? So it's important to name it. So people are thinking, oh my goodness, there's nothing wrong with me. This is actually a thing. This is something that other people might experience. I'm not the only one. Another thing is externalizing the devaluation that they feel. This is a direct way to heal the wounds of internalized devaluation. And so we help youth and adults and families understand why respect, and youth especially, why respect and the absence of respect are so important, right? And we see it in a lot of Black youth where people just assume that they're just angry and, you know, there's a lot of rage happening. But when you've learned that you're devalued and that you're not enough and that everything about your being is devalued, then you're fighting through for connection. Remember I talked about connection seeking. So you're fighting through to connect, and it's looked at only in a negative way because no one's pausing to think that this could be a young Black person seeking connection, because already you're criminalized. There's so many things that's considered bad about you, right? And so no one is ever stopping to think, oh, wow, it might be something else. Let's investigate, right? And so we want to help the young person understand why it's important. You give respect and expect that respect back, right? And it's called externalizing the devaluation. And so the last two, counteract devaluation, and this process of externalization, describe how you help the youth of color and Black youth exhale and expunge what society's norms are about them, right? So the toxins that society has then decided through stereotypes, through anti-Black racism, through media, through anything, through all these other avenues to hold together and to say, this is what it looks like to be Black. This is what your Blackness looks like. You're then going to be helping that young person to expunge that, to push that and say, this is not who you are. And so let's rewrite your narrative, right? Let's help you to rewrite your story. And so parents need to do that, teachers, social workers, anyone. And one thing I want to pause and say, if you're a Black parent and you're traumatized yourself, you need to get your work done. Like, you need to get your own support, clear that up so that you can be able to support your child. And so the final one is rechanneling of the rage. And so the pain of rage is a normal and predictable response to perpetual experiences. If you are followed in stores, you're stopped by police, you're told you're ugly, you have all these things that are happening. It's normal that rage is going to be pent up in you, right? And the experiences of degradation, devaluation, and domination. You're in a culture where you're dominated in almost everywhere that you look. And it's the buildup and culmination of emotions that have been blocked expression. So you haven't been able to express these emotions. And so the goal of any helping professional, of parents, of people that are dealing with Black youth, is to help them to be able to rechannel the rage, right? And really understanding the purpose of the rage. So we need to move away from looking at it as something bad and really investigate and interrogate our own mindset about what that rage might be for or what's causing it. That's it for me. And so I'll say, if you have any questions, let me know. And no one is here but me. I'm just kidding.
Lane, thank you so much for that presentation.
And don't tell me the 4 of us that attended.
It's all right. It's all right. That's
There's
totally
many on
okay.
YouTube. There's many on YouTube.
Okay.
So actually, there's a question that came up.
Okay.
I guess the question is, does each family's legacy, you mentioned, you spoke about legacy, does, each family's legacy diminish as each generation continues?
It's interesting though, but in my experience, Felicia, as I think about the Black experience, and when I say legacy in that way, I'm thinking about the intergenerational trauma pieces for Black people, right? Because the legacy, it doesn't matter who I am. I'm a professional Black woman. And then there are times I'm in spaces where I don't walk in that psychotherapy privilege. Do you know what I mean? Because I'm first seen as a Black woman. And so the legacy that I'm carrying around is not good, right? It's the notion of what Black represents, right? And the legacy of slavery, right? And intergenerational trauma. So I have that. D. Williams might have it too. We all just, and for different generations, say for instance, I'm going to use you, Felicia, if you don't mind. You are an Asian woman. You step somewhere, if you and I are best friends and say we were going to school together, the notion is you are going to be smart at math and you're going to be able to do, so all these stereotypes that comes with you is a legacy that's there. And that doesn't diminish over time because you have other Asian students who goes to school and that's, a part of the legacy that goes with them. So when I use legacy, that's the type of legacy I'm thinking, right? And when the young girl spoke about, when she was talking about microaggressions and she talked about, the legacy of privilege. She didn't say legacy, but I'm saying that just having the privilege of not having to care about certain things. And then for her, that came with guilt, right? And so for a Black-bodied person or other racialized body, what does whatever legacy your race comes with, what comes with that for you? For a lot of us in the Black body, it comes with a lot of trauma, right? But sometimes we don't know what to call it. The process of naming is just not there.
That was actually, I guess that was my question, as we, growing up, that stereotype of being Asian and good at math definitely followed me. And I guess the question is, that is my question actually, is as with each generation, does that stereotype diminish?
It depends on who's looking though, Felicia. It depends on who's looking, right? Because I guarantee you, I have Asian friends who are like, I'm not good at math. And so you in your body knows that not all Asian people are good at math, but it's who's looking. So it's not about you who is carrying the legacy, but it's about what societal norms are placed on you. That's what it's about. And so that's where the hurtful piece comes in for Black bodies, right? Because societal norms are telling Charmaine she cannot get out of a box. You're supposed to be pregnant and living on welfare with a couple of kids. These are the things that we think about Black women, whether we want to face it or not. And I think Dee said it at the onset. Some of the conversations are very uncomfortable, right? And so when we see someone, for instance, Felicia, because you placed yourself there, say I saw a young, I'm not saying me because I don't walk in those stereotypes, but someone sees a young Asian girl who's not good at math. Oh my goodness, how dare you not be good at math? Because of the norms of society. Or I remember when I worked in children's mental health, there were so many young people who was autistic, but the families would not accept it. Do you know what I mean? Because of the mental health, because of, no, you need to be achieving this, right? Or that. And so the legacy is not about you who's sitting in it. It's about who's putting it on you. Does that make sense?
That does. And I guess that is, as myself, right? Like, growing up, obviously, I do wonder, as our lived experiences are different than the generations before, how much of that will change and how much, how much will it diminish, like from one generation to another? And I guess that's my question is this something that you're
society
seeing?
needs it though, Felicia. That's what we fail to realize. They need that hierarchy of, it's a structure that's in place though. And unless it's being dismantled by, and I'll use this example. If I look on the screen of all the people I can see, I see 2 Black women, I see 3 racialized women then, and a white woman, right? 4 of us sitting here. I can't see anybody else. And so, yeah, when we look, we then say there's diversity, right? And so I always say this, diversity, this is my little thing that I use, diversity is inviting someone to the party, right? Inclusion is saying to the person, come and dance on the dance floor, right? So we're all at the party and we're allowed to dance. But equitable practices are then saying, what is that? Is that me? Equitable practices are then saying, did Charmaine, Felicia, and Dee get a chance to plan the party and to decide what foods are served and what music would be played, right? So until those things change, then the legacy stuff won't change. That stuff's not going to change because the decision makers have to be people who have different legacies to be able to contribute to that. Do you know what I mean? Because you're in a classroom, where someone is teaching your child. Yeah. It's just
Well,
it's an analogy that was used by a previous speaker was like, this is like a tangled spider's web that took a lot of time to tangle up and it's going to take time to untangle. But one of the questions I have for you, Lane, I love your analogy about getting stoned to death with peanuts. The analogy I like to use is like death by 1,000 scratches.
Yes.
Like, and the question I guess I have for you is, like, do you have any resources, and in addition to all of the, good advice that you gave about, naming it, like encouraging parents to like connect with their children on a daily basis and hear their stories. What happened at school today? Tell me the good, bad, and the ugly is what I would say. I want to hear what good happened. I want to hear the ugly and I want to hear the bad. I want to hear it all. And just like try to dig into those stories. Do you have like any books that you could recommend to parents of racialized kids? And in particular, since I'm a Black woman sitting here, how to help Black parents in particular deal with this notion of anti-Black racism, because the trauma is so real.
It's so real.
It's so real and it's so systemic. It's like you've dehumanized a whole race of people. And what does that poison do, not only to the bodies that have been dehumanized, but those living, possibly with, let's call it guilt or whatever feelings it is about sitting in privilege while other human beings are dehumanized.
What I'll say, D, is that I would recommend someone like, because I first think, D, you need to heal your own self. Do you know what I mean? Because the same resources that you'll need, that the children will need, you'll need. It's a matter of, because that's what I do with my own children. So Dr. Joy is a great person. Dr. Erlanger is a great person. Dr. Hardy, Dr. Comos Diaz, those people are amazing. They're on the slide. And I know that Margaret, you had a question about what's the name of the video. Yes, it's here. It's Dr. Joy DeGray. They can just look her up, post-traumatic slave syndrome. The reason I say that one, D, is because of the fact that Dr. Joy speaks generational peace. It gives us am I frozen? Oh.
You're freezing up now.
Am I okay or am I?
You're
Okay.
freezing up now.
Okay. Yeah,
So
I think
we'll
Patricia
share,
stuff, or was I?
We'll definitely share those resources. So I guess it's okay that we're close to the end of our presentation tonight, that all of the technical glitches start to appear. Lane, you're cutting in and out.
Yeah, Charmaine, you're cutting in and out. And so what we'll do is, from YouTube, I guess the presentation on YouTube would have a list of your videos.
Not sure what happened.
Oh,
Not sure
you're back. That's great to see you,
and
Charmaine.
I just saw one of my friends sent a message. I didn't even know she was on YouTube. I was trying to read it, then I got kicked out.
Okay.
This is so awesome.
So thank you so much. I think, like Dee said, we're nearing the end of our time, and I think these little technical glitches must be giving us a signal saying,
wrap it up.
But so I want to say thank you. Your talk definitely gave me a lot to think about, and thank you for those resources on healing our own traumas, so that we can help our children heal theirs as well.